Shalom. My name is Al, and this is our sixth part in our series, Matthew 24, verse 5, Israel the fig tree and the signs of our times. Today's topic, false Christs, false messiahs, and what makes a real messiah. Now, this is a real good question for my Jewish listeners, and for the Christians, sit back and learn something that you really have read many times, it's just you've never really noticed it. And as I stated yesterday, this is certainly not a presentation on astrology. If you would like to have your palm read, I suggest you go down to your neighborhood psychic. They will take your money. But for here, we're reciting what has been written in the scriptures. This particular book by Bullinger, The Witness of the Stars, is something we will glean on off and on. For it's a bit of information that your pastors should be sharing with you, but they have lost it along the way. Before verse 5 was verse 4, where Yeshua, Jesus, had warned people, "Take heed that you be not deceived." And this author who penned this book over 120 years ago in 1893 leaves us with this admonition. Be careful about a gospel of social sanitation. In other words, political correctness. And everybody is doing it today. But we're preaching here the word of Yahweh because we want to make it real, because the signs in your news, on your television every night, are starting to get more and more in everybody's face. Okay, looking at our timeline right here, we go back to the garden, as that's the only place we really could begin. And it needs to be pointed out, when the Father expelled the man and the woman from the garden, he just didn't let them go. He left them with a promise of hope, and that was that someday some woman is going to have a child that will grow up and crush the head of the serpent, which is Satan, and work out his plan of salvation. Thereby, that information was passed on to their progeny generation after generation after generation. And he had written it in the stars well before your Bibles were penned, or even Moses came along. We see this from Noah at his period in time, which was prophesied. And by the way, what did Messiah say in Matthew 24? That our days way down here would be as the days of Noah. However, mankind is always getting hooked by the enemy, because as the enemy was kicked out of the garden, who really is not a serpent, he is a spiritual being, he gets into everybody's houses and soon wrecks them. We see this with Cain, Abel, Jacob, 10 sons against one that try to kill him. Solomon, David builds this Camelot, and Solomon is deceived and it falls apart. And Israel's history has been rather bleak since then. The Christians will be devastated later on as well. So we see this struggle working itself out, but the knowledge of someday some woman is going to have a child to grow up and crush the head of the enemy is working itself out in the scriptures of the heavens. And we see this going down the line. Another noted point of interest is Nimrod's Babel, the first city built, Genesis 10, the Tower of Babel. And of course, what did that do? That hooked mankind on a false god, being Bel, the sun god, which later on will morph itself in all these other sun-based cultures, including our own today. Whereas the Jewish people still carrying on the calendar based on Yahweh's moon. So there's a big struggle taking place here. Everybody has bits and pieces of the story, but here we're trying to put them together to show you the big picture and how we're all involved. But as Babel will fall, others will rise in Samaria, Egypt, India, China, and Mesoamerica. They will carry information of the witness of the stars, of the promise of the woman as depicted in Virgo. However, time we get way down to Matthew 2, we're going to start to see something that has taken place, and it's certainly true today. And that is, when we take a look at Matthew, we see that now, when Jesus was born, Yeshua, in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, and behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, Where is he who is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and we have come to adorn him. At this point, the Jews had lost the story. They've lost the idea of someday a woman would be born that would bring forth a Savior. However, these foreigners coming from the East still had retained that information. So it's in this respect, as the story was lost, it's lost today, and we're going to pick it up where we can see it and make it real and show you that has nothing to do with astrology, but in all of these cultures, these sun-based cultures, it's always the same thing. It is a false religion. It is the worship in the sun in one aspect or another, or polytheism. It is the enemy in the house, wrecking it, destroying it, trying to stop the Father's children, first the Jews, later the Christians, from reaching their goal. And that is the struggle we are all in. And we pick it up in Ezekiel 1 to understand where this whole thing begins. And it's supposed to be here. Okay, Ezekiel 1. We pick it up in verse 2. In the 5th day of the month, which was the 5th year of King Jehoiakim's captivity. This would make it about 608 BCE, and these are the first wave of Jewish slaves being taken to Babylon. And he says in verse 4, I looked up and behold, a whirlwind came out of the north. Verse 5, also out of the midst therein came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. Verse 10, as their likeness was their faces, they each had the face of a man, the face of a lion on the right side, and the 4 had the face of an ox on the left, and they also had the face of an eagle. And thus were their faces, and their wings were stretched upward toward the wings of every one that joined this one and that one, and they covered their bodies. To understand this, we would have to take a look at what he is talking about. And in order to do that, we're going to go to the word cherub. Cherub, and in Hebrew, in the pictograph, it's spelled like this. The cherub. The modern Hebrew is like this. And it means, or it spells cherub in our English. What is this? This is actually the palm of a hand. Okay, so it's a palm of a hand. And what do you do with your palm? You can cover things, okay? And then finally, what you do with your hand is your will. Your will is what your hand does. This is the little man, which is the sum of. This is the 5th letter, called the Wa, or the Vav, and it connects, for it's a nail. And then finally we have the Beit, or the house, but of course the Father's house is not just your house, it is the creation. So when we put it together, cherub actually means the will of him who covers. So he covers himself as he is showing himself because, why? Because he is spirit. You can't see him. And we pick this up in Psalm, David writes in Psalm 18, verse 6. In my distress I call upon Yahweh, and I cried unto my Almighty, and he heard my voice out of the temple, and my cry came before him, even in his ears. Then the earth shook and trembled, and the foundations and also the hills moved, and they were shaking, because he was wroth. And there was smoke that came out of his nostrils, and fire out of his mouth, and devoured the coals and kindled it. And he bowed the heavens, and also came down, and darkness was under his feet, and he rode upon a cherub. He rode upon a cherub, which brings us now back to what we read the last time in part 5, when Moses quoted the prophet Balaam, and he says, and he shall pour out waters out of his buckets, and his seed shall be in many waters. His buckets. What does he mean, his buckets? Well, if Leo is the top here, which is the lion, there's only one constellation that is of a man and his buckets, and that would be Aquarius. Aquarius. And then he continues in verse 8, and the Almighty brought him forth out of Egypt. He has it, as it were, the strength of an ox, and shall eat up the nations. Again, we go to the zodiac, and there's only one place for a ox, and that's here in the form of Taurus, the bull. So, looking at this, what is the cherub? The face of a man, the face of a lion, the face of an ox, but here we have the enemy. We have the scorpion. How is that possible? And the answer is the scorpion is the serpent, which is the dragon, which is the devil. And it has to go, and it will go, and it will be replaced someday by the eagle. But that is down the timeline. So, as we're looking at this, we now need to look at our new covenant in Revelations chapter 4. So go to Revelations chapter 4. We pick it up in verse 6, and it says this, and before the throne there were a sea of glass like crystal, and in the midst of the throne and around the throne there was 4 beasts full of eyes and behind. And the first beast was like a lion, the second like a calf, the ox, and the third beast the face of a man, and the fourth beast like a flying eagle. Verse 10, and the 24 elders fall down before him who sits upon the throne and worship him that liveth forever, saying, worthy art Yahweh the Almighty. So, we have 24. And we go like this. If Leo is the lion, 12 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 9 o'clock. Each is a cherub. Each has a face. And now there's 24 elders. That would make it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. This is Yahweh's solar biblical clock. It is your scriptures, and you have never been shown what time it is. And I guarantee you this, that as we move down the timeline, Everything is done in His time. We are now looking at the ceiling on these massive stone columns in a temple called Esna along the Nile River in Egypt. I haven't been to this particular site, but I've been to the massive temple at Karnak across from Luxor. And what these civilizations, such as India, China, Mesoamerica, and Egypt all have in common, they had to be able to tell time, and that means it goes back to the sun and the zodiac, the 12 months out of the year. We are now looking at a zodiac on the ceiling of the Brooklyn Museum. Archaeology really didn't become a science in itself to about the 1850s, and then you started to get major expeditions heading usually from England, later France, Germany, and America, down to the Middle East, and digging up what they could, some say stealing, and bringing it back to their own cultures and starting what we know as our museums today. Either way, the story that we are going to pursue goes back to the woman and her seed, which we had already seen in Virgo working itself out, being fulfilled in Scorpio, stinging Ophiuchus on the heel, which is really Genesis 3:15. And so the son is born, he performs the sacrifice, and now we're going to start to see in our next portion of the zodiac wheel altogether, as we move down the line, we're going to see the next phase of the interaction of the sun and the enemy, as all of these characters, scorpions and serpents, suns and lions, are all based on the struggle between Christ, the Messiah, and Satan, as the Father works out his giant plan in the beginning, Bereshit, Genesis 1:1. Our next picture is of the map we're going to be using. Bullinger himself drew this map from a much older drawing than at his time, 1893. And now let's pick it up, and to do so, go to 4 o'clock and in the sign of Sagittarius. In relation to the stars and the zodiac signs, looking up, it's hardly possible to make out a man, a woman, let alone a centaur with a bow and arrow. However, what gives these star signs, these star pictures, their stories behind them, is this. And we look at Psalm 147, verse 4. He telleth the number of the stars, he calleth them by their names. And we notice also in Isaiah 40, verse 25, to whom then will you liken me, or shall I be equal, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes on high, and behold, who hath created these, that bringeth out their host by number, he calleth them all by names, and by the greatness of his might, for that he is strong in power, and not one faileth. And David records in Psalm 45, verse 1, my heart is inditing a good matter. I speak of the things which I have made, touching the king. My tongue is a pen of a ready writer, or a scribe. Thou art fairer than the children of men. Grace is poured upon thy lips, and therefore the Almighty has blessed thee forever. Gird thy sword upon thy side, O most mighty, with glory and thy majesty, and in thy majesty ride prosperously, because truth and meekness and righteousness, and thy right hand shall teach thee terrible things, and thy arrows are sharp in the heart of the king's enemy, whereby the people shall fall upon thee. And of course, if you reread Revelation 19, it's all about the second coming.
John, in his Apocalypse, even records, and in his vision, he sees the same thing, conquering to go forth. And he says, a white horse, and he who sat on him had a bow, and he went forth conquering to conquer. The Hebrew and Syriac name of the sign is Keith, which means the archer, and in Genesis 21:20, the Arabic name is Al-Qas, the arrow. In Coptic, Pimaker, the graciousness, or the beauty of the coming forth. In Greek, it is Toxis, the archer, and in Latin, Sagittarius. There are 69 stars in the sign, 5 of the third magnitude, all in his bow, and the 9th of the 4th. The names of the brightest stars are significant. The Hebrew is Na'im, which means the gracious one. This is exactly what is said of the victor in the same psalm. In the words immediately preceding the quotation in Psalm 45, grace is poured into thy lips, therefore has the Almighty blessed thee forever. The Hebrew natusha, the giving or sending forth, we see in the same in the Arabic names which have come down to us as El-Naim, the gracious one, Al-Shula, the dart, Al-Warida, which comes forth, Rukaba, Al-Sai, Rami, the riding of the bowman, and in ancient Akkadian name the sign is Nun-Ki, which means Prince of the Earth. So, in all of these pictures, he is similarly represented, and the arrow in his bow is aimed directly at the heart of the scorpion.